Hey guys, this is Module 2. With this lesson, we are starting Section 3, which is sensory systems. In this lesson, we go over the auditory system. The next one we'll go over the visual system and the tactile system. We will put these into context with the whole brain and then talk about them in relation to neurotech. So we know that on the smallest scale, signaling in the brain is the action potential passing down the axon. And in larger networks, these signals are the basis for behavior as well as sensation. Our key questions for today are: what is the auditory cortex? How is auditory sensation processed? And how can hearing be restored? So the auditory cortex is located on the top side of the temporal lobe. Out of the cortices associated with sensation, there's relatively little known about the auditory cortex, but we know it can be subdivided into A1, which is the primary auditory cortex, and higher cortical areas. The primary auditory cortex is loosely organized according to characteristics of sound. The most prominent organizational feature is frequency, which we will see as a theme as we move on in the auditory cortex. Many pathways leading to the auditory cortex are arranged according to a tonotopic map, which means they're arranged according to frequency. A1 also has regions of neurons that encode for loudness, direction of a sound, ear specificity, rate of sound, etc. Higher auditory areas receive signals from the auditory cortex for deeper interpretation that is necessary for understanding language. The auditory cortex contains information from the contralateral ear as well as the ipsilateral ear. So if I'm talking about the auditory cortex in my right hemisphere, then the contralateral ear is this one and the ipsilateral ear is this one. However, the signals from the contralateral ear are stronger, and if there is specific stimulation of one ear, often there is inhibition of signals from the other ear. So how does all of this information get to the auditory cortex in the first place? Sound processing begins with the ear. There are three relevant sections: the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. So the outer ear is all that's outside the body, pretty self-explanatory. The middle ear is directly inside, behind the eardrum, and it contains three bones. And then the inner ear is a series of tube-like structures, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. The most inner surface of the outer ear contains the eardrum, which is a membrane that responds to pressure waves produced by sound. The movements of the eardrum causes very coordinated displacement of three bones in the middle ear, which in turn activates specific structures within the inner ear that causes hearing. We will be focusing on the structures of the inner ear to understand hearing from a biological standpoint before diving into auditory prostheses. So the inner ear collectively can be referred to as the cochlea. There are many substructures within the cochlea that are important to hearing, but the most important for us is the basilar membrane. The basilar membrane is home to thousands of hair cells that move in response to mechanical stimulations from the middle ear. The hair cells vary in length and are connected to one another in complex ways. They contain channels that respond to physical deformation in the membrane, meaning they can open when the hairs move. The opening of these channels causes an influx of positive ions, depolarizing the membrane and beginning the action potential. These specific transmitters are called mechanotransduction channels. So a deeper look into these mechanosensitive hair cells. When a signal is received, the hair cells, the shorter ones, tip towards the longer ones, which causes depolarization. And like I said before, spiking in the auditory nerve encodes for frequency, loudness, and timing of the sound input. The specific protein that links the hair cells is called cahedrin, which is just a fun little fact. And so, yes, we already said that tipping towards a taller hair cell causes depolarization, so tipping towards a shorter hair cell causes hyperpolarization. Next, we have this schematic of movement to the auditory cortex. I know my video is blocking where the auditory cortex is, but that's the final step of this pathway. So once a signal is transduced along the basilar membrane, it passes through a series of nuclei before going to the auditory cortex. These nuclei, like the eardrum and the auditory cortex are all organized according to a tonotopic map. The first set of neurons that are activated are the spiral ganglion neurons. Their axons make up the auditory nerve, so spiral ganglion neurons equals auditory nerve. The signal is then passed to specific structures in the brainstem and the midbrain, where they're further processed before being sent to the thalamus. The structures in the midbrain in particular are connected to other sensory cortices, such as the visual and somatosensory cortices, as sound can serve as feedback for other systems and vice versa. Once the signal reaches the thalamus, it is then sent to the auditory cortex, where it's first received in A1, and then it moves to those higher cortical areas. All right, there are two types of hearing loss. There's conductive hearing loss and sensory neural hearing loss. Conductive hearing loss is typically associated with an issue with the bones in the middle ear, or maybe scar tissue buildup. What we're going to be talking about, though, is sensory neural hearing loss, which is an issue with the pathways in the inner ear. So this is issues with the cochlea. A cochlear prosthesis, or cochlear implant, provides a way to go around a damaged cochlea through implanting electrodes to pick up and convey a signal to auditory pathways. A unit will pick up a sound, decompose the frequency components, and send these electrical signals along wires to small antennas implanted in the temporal bone. The activation of these antennas causes action potentials in the auditory nerve. The setup of a cochlear implant takes advantage of the tonotopic map, with electrodes coordinated to match areas of higher and lower frequency. It's been discovered that 20 electrodes can mimic complex sound. So we talked about the mechanotransduction of sound. It occurs on the basilar membrane, where disturbance of hair cells depolarizes the membrane and sends a signal through the auditory nerve. The signal is then sent through various other structures according to a tonotopic map and eventually reaches the auditory cortex, where it is processed further. Sensory neural hearing loss can be fixed through a cochlear implant, which bypasses damaged hair cells and stimulates the auditory nerve. And in the next lesson, we will be reviewing visual processing.